How's it going, you guys, and welcome to your morning cup. Let's talk about mandatory military service and what that actually means in terms of does the world actually need conscriptions to come back? Now, there are a lot of nations in the world that currently ascertain towards conscriptions. Conscriptions meaning drafting, meaning the ability for the government in all of its power to make sure that it can call upon the regular people, the regular Joes that are in the actual age brackets that are required to be called into action, could be called into mandatory military training and then deployment, even though people might not necessarily want to be involved. Now, what we understand is the fact that there are a lot of pros and there are a lot of cons to this issue, and there's no other way around it. People might ascertain towards the pros of the issue, dictating that it helps mold a civilization towards the betterment of it, considering that the social structure becomes significantly better, considering that discipline comes into play, considering the fact that people's general impression about each other changes drastically. And this is an argument that has been thousands of years old, made by a Roman general way back in the day, dictating that if two people from different forms of life serve through military training together, it helps unite a people under the same common umbrella of patriotism, which is of course a thing considering that borders are very much prevalent and people are still fighting left, right, and center, even though humanity above all should be a thing that we understand in the 21st century. But considering that war is always going to be prevalent and difference of opinions is always going to be prevalent, it is by all specs of the imagination something that holds a lot of accord. We also understand the fact that an anti-terror element comes into play, dictating the fact that if at all there is a terror attempt anywhere on the world, people of that specific nation, if have received ample amount of military training, can be of ginormous help. The regular Joe affected by a terrorist act is usually scared and unable to do anything about it, considering that fear takes over. But if a military professional is in that same scenario and has undergone some amount of significant training, they are very well aware of what they need to do in order to compromise the situation and make it lean over to their side of the equation, rather than just being at the mere mercy of a terrorist organization. What we understand here, however, is the fact that not everyone is built for the military, and by this we move on towards the genre of what might be the actual cons of this issue. Now, you see, the essence of choice matters most. We are essentially living in a democracy, and everywhere else on the world that has certain amounts of freedom attached to it is a democracy. And when it comes to democracies, there's always choice involved. People can choose to be involved in the military. Everyone in the world can choose to be involved in the military. But then again, there are people that do not want to choose to be a part of the military in any way, shape, or form. Those people, by any specs of the imagination, cannot be held accountable for not wanting to do so. You see, when you're living in a nation that has the opportunity to present you with different variables in life, you can't just relinquish all of those variables to start building national service. And by no means can you dictate the fact that those people are less patriotic than the ones that are serving their nation. Anyone who's a part of a democratic society is paying taxes, anyone who's part of a democratic society is voting, and thereby is a functional member of society of said nation, thereby doing their due diligence as well towards the betterment of the country as a whole. Yes, they might not be putting their lives at risk and doing as much as an active duty military personnel does, but thereby they don't get half the respect that a military official does as well. They don't get half the benefits that the government offers to military professionals as well. So it kind of balances the issue out. People are very well aware of the fact that if you're an active duty personnel, you get certain benefits, you get certain guidelines in place, you get certain respect levels in place, and even after you leave the military, there is and always will be that tag affiliated to you that you served your nation. Yeah, in certain situations where you're trying to move abroad and work in a different nation, that can come back to haunt you in some way, shape, or form, considering that there are a few nations that might not necessarily want to hire an ex-military official, considering that there are millions of things in place. People believe there might be spies involved or things of that accord. But usually that never comes into play, and instead you're given more priority based on the sheer significance of the fact that you have a certain level of discipline to you, you have a certain level of capability to you that your government realized, that your military realized, and thereby took you in, took you under their wing, and you served a great part of your life in the military and did great things for your nation. But what we also understand is the fact that there are numerous people that might not necessarily be fit for the military services at all. You see, there's a very diligent vetting process when it comes to military organizations across the world, and this vetting process, by all specs of the imagination, is very much necessary because people are very diverse and not everyone is, well, fit to serve. Not everyone is capable of serving. Not everyone is able to retain their cognitive capabilities and put themselves in harm's way to make sure that they are doing betterment for your fellow soldier. Some people turn into a liability under pressure zones, and those are people that are most definitely not required to be part of the military, because you might just put other people's lives in danger in an active threat scenario. But what we also understand is the fact that there are numerous sleeper cells that are involved in numerous nations that are already been built in by terrorist organizations. And if mandatory service comes into play, these sleeper cell agents, who are actually citizens of this nation or any nation for that matter of fact, will also receive the same training as everyone else does. And these sleeper cell agents, if you will also have a very close understanding of what might be the inner workings of the nation's reserve force program or the nation's military training program if mandatory service is something that comes into play. You see, there are a lot of tiny little nicks and crannies that need to be considered when we're talking about nations that want to bring back mandatory service, bring back the ability to draft people. And now that we have spoken about those two issues, we also need to understand the fact that there are ample amount of nations that currently do have mandatory service in place. Of course, we're talking about nations like South Korea, we're talking about nations like Finland, Sweden, Russia, Israel, and other nations that are planning to bring that back. France is currently in talks about trying to bring back mandatory service. India is currently in talks to bring in mandatory service as well. And the same pros and cons apply to every single nation under the sky. But what we also understand is the fact that there are different nations with different policies in place. The EU has 7 member states that currently hold together mandatory service. We have nations like Israel that has mandatory 3 years of service. Considering that it's surrounded by regions that are constantly in conflict and constantly against it, some might say that it makes more sense for the people of Israel to enroll and to serve a minimum of 3 years that is actually doing better for the country itself. But there's always arguments against that as well. Also, we understand the fact that way back in the day, it was very gender oriented. People always preferred males to enroll, but that stereotype has been shattered recently, considering that the latest conscriptions mark that females are just as much required to enroll as their male counterparts. But we also understand the fact that nations like North Korea that are strong dictatorships, as well as nations like Turkmenistan that are strong dictatorships, have their own agendas in place. North Korea supposedly has a mandatory 10 years of military service, post which most people just don't leave because there's nothing else in the country to do. People in Turkmenistan are facing somewhat of the same issue. And nations like those have a way different ball game to them, considering that they're not democracies and a choice value is very minuscule in such nations. It's just up for speculation as to whether the people are actually going to be able to do better for themselves if they're not put into mandatory services. With that being said, this is a very open-ended topic. There's room for debate, there's room for speculation, and there's always room for more information being added. And considering that, let's just open it up for debate. Like, if you have something to say about this issue, make sure you drop it down in the comment section below, and I'll be in there replying to as many comments as I can, be engaging in conversation, because topics like this deserve to be spoken about. If nothing else, your opinions are just as important as anyone else's, considering that this is a thing that is going to be affecting global impressions and a united front of humanity as a whole. Do you believe that if mandatory service is something that is established across the globe, will it be something that is going to affect our future agendas of being a united front or not? Do you believe nations like China, nations like Russia will ever let go of mandatory service, or will they always hold on to their own pre-existing agendas and never ever come under a common umbrella that we can step forward as human species and without borders, without having any issues between us, and rather looking up at the stars for any and all resources that we currently might be fighting for? It's all up for speculation, and who knows, maybe even if we do become an interplanetary species, nations take the next big leap and start claiming entire planets. It's all up for speculation, as I said earlier. But with that being said, this has been your morning cup. See you tomorrow.